Some water.
Yes,
No, usually just a minute while we get some water and then we'll go ahead.
I think we're
Seem to have ended up on panels with
No, I like them.
quite a lot
They're a
over
subtle
the
way.
past couple of years.
And we start
Mainly talking
projecting
about
into the room.
Oh yes, someone forget that I'm back.
He's been, it's been good fun.
Yeah, he's
work
here
away
at
there.
the conference.
Is he?
Yeah,
Follow
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
glasses. Oh, where did I sit down?
Yeah.
Simon Verley.
Really,
I can't see your name.
yes. I forgot my glasses.
Oh, good, great.
Glasses.
Rooney. There we go.
Sad, isn't it? When you get to the age where you can actually read your notes on the screen else.
Yes.
So, that answers my question. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, particularly with economic events shifting so quickly. My name is Rachel Statham. I'm Associate Director for Work and Welfare State at IPPR. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you all to talk about the cost of living crisis and how policymakers can respond to it. So you've got an excellent expert panel around me, and they'll be growing through the event. As you might see, Seema Malhotra isn't here yet, but will be joining us shortly. So I'll introduce our speakers. They'll have a few minutes to give you some introductory remarks. Then we'll have some questions and a chance for you to ask your questions as well. So if you've got some that are taking over as you're sitting and listening, please do keep them to mind, and we'll be roaming mics as we go as well. So, by way of introduction, we have Ruini Purcell, who is Director of External Affairs at Citizens Advice, obviously doing critical work day by day at the moment, both to respond to the cost of living crisis with practical advice, but also to keep track of what's happening to people's lives and incomes through challenging economic times, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the important work that they're doing. Simon Verley joins me here as UK Vice Chair and Head of Energy and Natural Resources at KPMG to speak to their work responding to an energy crisis that is constantly changing. And my colleague George Dibb, who leads our Centre for Economic Justice at IPPR, including our work responding to the cost of living crisis. It's really delighted to be joined by you all today. So we'll be speaking to a kind of very live topic, so I'm sure no one's kind of surprised or questioning what we might be getting into this afternoon. But the cost of living crisis is obviously at the forefront of people's minds, both through our own lives and as we're seeing kind of steep price rises, increases to the energy price gap, and really rapid changes across our economy that right now seem to be happening kind of by the minute rather than by the day. A key issue obviously underpinning the economic challenges we're dealing with right now are these soaring energy prices that we'll be able to get into to look at both how government should respond to support households, but also to support businesses and the wider economy. We'll be looking towards which short-term measures are needed to respond to the acute crisis we're experiencing now and through this winter, but also what longer-term measures we need to make sure that we have energy security and stability and sustainability in the years ahead too. So plenty to be getting into. So without further ado, I'm going to first turn to our speakers to start to set the scene. And we're looking forward to hearing both from them and from you all this afternoon. So thanks very much for joining us. First, I'll go to Ruini.
Hi everyone. Oh, and the mic works, so I don't need to check that. I'm from Citizens Advice, and thanks to the IPPR and KPMG for inviting me today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'm just going to start by introducing Citizens Advice. Hopefully you all know who we are, but we help around 2 million people each year on a range of issues across England and Wales and in partnership with Citizens Advice Scotland. Key to that though is that we work as part of a federated structure, so we work with 270 local Citizens Advice. So we deliver services online, face-to-face and through telephone. And that national network gives us a real understanding of the issues that people are struggling with right now and how that changes week on week, day by day. It gives us a really accurate picture. And the picture we're seeing is really, really concerning. We're seeing more people coming to us for crisis support. So that's referrals to food banks, that's fuel vouchers. We have seen a 50% rise in the need for crisis referrals compared to this time last year. Even if you look at here in the Northwest, sadly, we're above our national average. We're seeing a 70% rise in need for crisis referral. Many of those people are needing that support for the first time. Last month, 3/4 of people who needed that crisis support were actually first-time users. Unsurprisingly, we're also seeing unprecedented support for energy issues. Historically, people have come to us with concerns around local council tax. That's been our #1 issue, but actually that's been vastly superseded by the need for support with energy bills. We've supported nearly 55,000 people so far this year, and that's nearly as many people that we were supporting for the whole of 2021. And to put that in context, we're talking about people who were struggling with basic things like having hot showers, keeping the fridge on, putting the hob on, having to face really, really stark choices between literally eating or heating their homes. So we have a few concerns based on the trends that we're seeing. We are really concerned about prepayment customers who can't afford to top up their prepayment meters. So again, they'll just be cut off, just like that. They won't be able to keep their warms home. They won't be able to switch their fridge on. We're really also concerned about people who are struggling with bills already, who are going to be forced onto those prepayment meters, and we're seeing more and more of that through our data. So effectively, that is disconnection through the back door. And as we head into a winter where people might not be able to top up their prepayment meters, they're going to be in a very, very difficult situation indeed. And again, there's always stories behind those stats, so I just wanted to share a couple of examples, and sadly, these are stories that we've become all too familiar with, but it's worth reminding ourselves what it actually means for people in a day-to-day sense. So one of our advisors in Gateshead said that they were helping a lady who was really worried about the cost of using her stair lift, so she was actually seriously considering about whether she should live on the bottom floor of her house or the top floor of her house. The problem is her bathroom's upstairs and her kitchen's downstairs. But those are the choices that some people are making. We spoke to a mother who was concerned about the cost of looking after a newborn baby. She's cutting down her showering to 2 to 3 times a week. She's bathing her daughter in a box rather than a bath because of the cost of heating the water. The volume of that is just too much for her to worry about. There's a 70-year-old that we've talked to recently who struggles with osteoarthritis. It's really important for her to have a warm home. To be healthy, but actually she can only heat her home for 2 or 3 hours a day. And the rest of that time, she's wearing extra clothes, she's putting on caps and gloves. And this is even ahead of the winter. That's the thing, that we are seeing issues this summer that we wouldn't be expecting to. I mean, we're into the autumn now, but looking at our most recent data, we're seeing patterns that we would normally expect to see in the winter than at the start of the year as well. So I think for us, we are concerned. We're seeing that there are families really struggling out there with a range of issues, and actually energy bills is one of those. They're facing with, inflation, a whole range of daily costs that they are struggling with. They're kind of literally playing guacamole, trying to work out how they are going to cover those costs. So it's welcome that there have been packages of support that have been announced over the course of this year. Our concern is that they need to be targeted to those most in need. Obviously, there have been, earlier this year, offers of targeted support through the benefit system, through reductions in council tax as well. The interesting thing that we saw in our own data is those initial payments went into people's bank accounts in July. And when we looked at our data, when we looked at the number of people who needed that crisis support, we did actually see a drop in July when those first payments started hitting accounts, but actually that was really short-lived. Our demand levels went up again the following month. So it is really, really short-lived. The support that we're seeing so far, it isn't really matching the rising scale of bills that we're seeing. And I think we need some clarity. But that's for households, but also small businesses as well. What is going to happen in 2 years' time when the current price rise will go? Who's going to be paying for the bill freeze that's been most recently announced? Is that going to be like hitting our own bills, and will consumers be paying those costs longer term? Small businesses will have already been accruing energy debts over the course of the past 1 to 2 years. They need to understand what happens in 6 months' time, because the initial package has been offered for 6 months. What is a repayment package looking like for them? Is that sustainable? There's a real need here to look at short and long-term policy solutions. People are struggling right now, so we need to make sure that they're being supported in the ways that they need to, and it's targeted to those most in need, and that government is ready to step in and offer more support, because we need to have solutions that match the scale of the crisis and that they monitor and track what's needed there. But also we need an exit strategy out of this. We need to be thinking long-term, how are we going to be enabling and empowering people to kind of pay their bills and make them affordable? For us, the key solution there is looking at energy efficiency. We need to be investing in a national energy advice system where we are helping people insulate their homes. We are tackling those properties that are the most energy efficient. We could be saving hundreds of pounds on bills for individuals. So we need to be having an investment in that to ensure that we have the infrastructure to enable energy efficient households. We need to be giving people the information and advice to help them make informed choices. It's quite a complex subject area. How do we make that accessible? How do we make people understand the choices that they can and should be making? How can we make sure that they're protected as consumers, so they're being offered the right solutions in a way that supports their needs as well?
Thank you very much. Simon.
Well, thanks, and very much agree, and it's concerning, isn't it, to hear those stories, and it hasn't even got cold yet, so, you know, we're not even into the depths of winter. I want to compliment what you were saying, really, with a sort of macro look and look at it from an overall economy perspective. And I'm unashamedly going to focus on energy because that's where this crisis started. It's also what I do as my day job in terms of advising companies about energy and the energy transition. And the first point I want to make is to recognise just the necessary intervention that obviously the government's made, but the fact that it now needs to be targeted, I think in the way that you were hinted, on those that need the help the most, because I think we've seen the reaction from the financial markets, which is this level of borrowing is completely unsustainable. And to the question, who's going to pay? Well, unfortunately, we're all paying, because with the pound tanking, that means inflation, and that means the cost of living is going to go up further. And with interest rates now looking likely to rise, the forward curve as of this morning is showing interest rates rising to over 5% next year, which obviously would then hit borrowing costs, mortgage costs, etc. So to some extent, we're all going to end up paying if we don't have as you put it, a sustainable plan. So for me, the first point here really is we've got to find a way to target the help on those that need it most. And many, many European countries are doing this right now. There are lots and lots of ways you can do this. You can relate it to benefits, you can relate it to income scales, you can have social tariffs, which basically protect those more vulnerable groups. And many, many European countries are going down this route, so that we're not providing blanket support for everybody at the same level. And I think we do need to get it on a more sustainable basis, because just a reminder of the figures, the headlines from Friday's announcements were all about the 45 billion of tax cuts over 5 years. Remember, the government is spending 60 billion, plus or minus tens of billions, because nobody really knows, in 6 months. Okay, so that just remember the sort of scale of the package and the intervention here. And the reason I mentioned the error margin around that is because it all depends how cold this winter is, and it all depends what happens to world gas prices and how much economic activity is. So I used to work in the Treasury, I used to work in the Department of Energy and Climate Change. If I was doing that costing, I would be putting big error margins around it, because nobody really knows how much that's going to cost. And we can say it costs the government, but ultimately that's costing everybody. So there needs to be a better way of targeting the support. I think that I very much agree with that. And I think to your point about business support, I've got lots and lots of clients, particularly smaller firms, who are really unsure about what's happening after April. So obviously the government said for household it's for 2 years, the support, but for business it's for the next 6 months. Now if you're trying to plan ahead for next year's orders, you've got no idea at the moment beyond the next 6 months what your energy bill is going to be. So that is a really urgent task. Obviously, the government said that Jacob Rees-Mogg's going to be reviewing which sectors get support beyond next March. But that, again, coming to this point about targeting and early signals, I think is really, really important. And we need to, again, focus that not on big companies that can afford to pay their energy bills, but on smaller firms and on energy-intensive firms. And those are the sectors in business that need the support rather than, larger companies. Dare I say KPMG, but, let's just say larger companies, because we need to target the support on those that need it most. So I think targeting is my first point. I think the second point I really want to make is very much to agree with your point about the demand side. We've heard a lot from the government about supply side measures, and we can come on to whether any of those supply side measures maybe in the Q&A are actually going to do any good. But what's happening in many European countries is an urgent push on energy efficiency right now, as you were calling for, ahead of this winter. So the European Commission has set a target of trying to reduce energy demand by 20% ahead of this winter, which, if you do it through energy efficiency, is a permanent reduction in bills. It's not just, let's just get through this winter by spending £60 billion. It's a permanent reduction in bills. Now, energy efficiency, the government did announce £1 billion of extra funding over the next 3 years on Friday. And just by way of contrast, we are spending £1 billion every 3 days in terms of the support for energy bills this winter. So just, again, contrast, we've announced £1 billion for the next 3 years on energy efficiency. We're spending £1 billion every 3 days on the bill support package. That, in my view, is the wrong way round. We should be really having a step change in energy efficiency. That's the way to get bills down permanently. That's the way you reduce our dependency on imported gas. And that is the way that ultimately you reduce emissions in the most cost-effective way, and we get on a way to net zero. So for me, the government talks about its energy supply strategy, and we can come back to whether fracking and all the rest of it's going to actually help. But the thing that is completely absent at the moment is a serious push on energy efficiency and on permanently reducing our energy demand. And my third point really is, and I was very pleased to hear it in the announcements today from the main hall about using all forms of low carbon energy to get bills down over the longer run. And by that I mean that we need to be using all the low carbon technologies we have, which are both available and cheap. So that means onshore wind, that means solar, that means getting going with hydrogen and carbon capture, as well as obviously the big ramp up in offshore wind. And there was a rather amusing line in the growth plan on Friday which talked about, with surprise, no new onshore wind farms have been built since 2015. Well, that was because we had a planning system that banned onshore wind, which is one of the cheapest forms of low carbon energy. So we can get bills down permanently. The great news is that going low carbon isn't now just the right thing to do, it's the cheapest thing to do. So, low carbon is the cheaper option, and we need to utilize all the forms of low carbon energy if we're to get to net zero at the least cost and get bills down permanently and improve our energy security. So I was encouraged to hear, what we heard from Labour today. But, things like pausing the energy bill, well, a lot of clauses in the energy bill actually underpin the future hydrogen economy, the future carbon capture projects that we need if we're to have homegrown clean energy and get bills down permanently. So I think my 3 points, just to sort of sum up, are: one, we've got to find a way to target this. We can't keep spending £1 billion every 3 days. because ultimately we're all paying for that through higher inflation and higher interest rates already. Secondly, we've got to work on the demand side, and third, we've got to use all the sources of low carbon energy if we're to get to net zero at least cost. So I'll pause there and happy to
Thank you
take
very
any
much.
questions.
I'll turn next to George.
Yeah, thank you. And it's quite an incredible moment to be having this conversation, talking about the serious economic crisis that we find ourselves in. If someone could shout out from the audience if the pound reaches parity with the dollar, or if the Bank of England puts up interest rates while we're talking, I think that would be really helpful. We're in an incredible moment where the scale of the crisis and the rate at which it seems to be developing is really quite stark. And we're also at a moment when the government seems to be heading in the opposite direction of where we need to be heading. IPPR has been talking about the cost of living crisis since earlier this year, and we've been consistent throughout in trying to make the case that there are three things which are intimately linked and are not separable in the way that you confront this economic crisis. That is supporting households and household incomes, it's supporting businesses and the economy more widely, and it's using this moment to accelerate and double down on our transition towards net zero. And I think these three things pull together both what we heard earlier from Simon and from Ruani about households and businesses, that you can't pick and choose and do one of these things, because if households face the largest fall in their real incomes in recorded history, they will be spending less money in the economy. They'll be spending less money on the high street. They'll be spending less money down the pub. That costs the economy, so it's very important that we support household incomes, not just to support businesses, but because it's the right and the moral thing to do. But also, we want to avoid this crisis having lasting negative consequences for the economy. We invested billions during the COVID crisis in furlough and in loan schemes to support the economy. If we're to throw that all away now and have a whole wave of bankruptcies caused by energy price spikes, that would be wasted. And as Simon just said, clean energy and renewable energy is now the cheapest way of generating electricity. I come from a science and innovation background. I worked on solar and on photovoltaics when it was incredibly expensive, when we were chasing cost parity with gas and with coal. Renewables coming on grid now are about 9 times cheaper than gas prices. So the clean way of decarbonising our energy supply is no longer in conflict with the economics or the macroeconomics. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If you look at your gas meter this winter and it's spinning fast, that's not just measuring your energy bill, it's also measuring the gross national debt, because every single therm of gas you use is adding to government borrowing. So one other thing that I wanted to raise is this question of who pays for this crisis. It's worth clarifying that we're not in a state of generalized inflation. That might be the case in some other countries, probably in the US, where price rises across the economy are all correlated and moving in the same direction, and that includes the price of labor. That is not the case in the UK. We're not in a state of generalized inflation. We are seeing a distinct energy price spike, but that has different characteristics to generalized inflation. And it means that it's worth having a kind of more nuanced conversation about which businesses are doing well from this crisis and which aren't, because there are some firms in specific sectors who are profiting at the moment. Most prominently, of course, that has been oil and gas firms, BP and Shell, making record share buybacks and dividend schemes. That's a direct wealth transfer from the households that Ruani described suffering. But it's also in sectors like mining and mineral extraction, and notably chemicals and also tobacco. We did a big bit of work earlier in the year called Prices and Profits After the Pandemic, where we looked at profit rates across the economy since before the pandemic, and gross profits on the whole are up by 34%. But 90% of that increase comes from just 25 companies, and they're concentrated in the most concentrated and uncompetitive markets in the UK economy. So I think we also need to look at that market structure. It's also quite difficult to pull those threads out of how energy prices are cascading through the private sector. Because the UK has had energy price cap just for domestic users, energy didn't show up very strongly in CPI, in consumer price inflation, the kind of normal measure of inflation across the economy, but things like food and other goods did. That wasn't because those prices were going up because of inflation. It was energy prices cascading through the economy, and that's quite a difficult thing to unpick, but something that we need to do. But the data is pretty mixed on input and output inflation, and the government is only latterly coming to this question quite late. So how can we, what's the right policy response to this challenge, this unprecedented challenge? Firstly, the conventional response to inflation is to raise interest rates. That pulls demand out of the economy, well, that's how it's conventionally understood, which cools the economy down and brings inflation back down. But as I just said, we're not in a conventional inflationary crisis, and the evidence is mixed on whether monetary policy is actually the right way of fighting this crisis. We supported the use of energy price caps to bring energy prices down for consumers who are struggling, but also to bring down inflation as a whole. If we reduce energy prices, that shows up in CPI, and it means that those headline rates of inflation will come down. And most importantly, that's not using monetary policy. We know that by increasing interest rates, the people who suffer from that are likely to be those in vulnerable employment, those on lower incomes. Monetary policy tends to hit the poorest hardest, whereas taking that energy price cap and putting it into government borrowing, i.e. using fiscal policy, is a fairer way to do it because the government is able to choose who then bears the burden of that bailout, essentially. And it can do that by taxation, by spreading that burden among people who maybe are doing better. For example, we already have taxes which are targeted on people who are doing well. Corporation tax is only paid by profitable firms. Capital gains tax is only paid by people whose assets are increasing in value. So combining a large fiscal energy price cap with fair and progressive taxation would be a good way of controlling this crisis. Unfortunately, the government have gone in the exact opposite direction by taking energy price caps and combining it with regressive tax cuts. That is a pretty toxic combination, and you can see that in the market response. And lastly, I absolutely agree with Simon and Ruani that the energy price caps are not the solution to this problem. What we've essentially done is bought ourselves time. And we've bought ourselves time to both bring those to bring down the cost of energy by bringing those renewables on stream. We've brought ourselves time to bring on stream things like housing, energy retrofit, and energy efficiency measures in the private sector, which have fallen off a cliff since 2012, and we need to rapidly get back moving. And just a note before I finish on the way that policymakers in the UK are approaching this problem, because I think what's characterised all the response throughout has been the last-minute nature of the policy response. So, and also kind of really hoping that the crisis will go away by itself, and I think we have to be realistic. If you remember back at Rishi Sunak's spring statement in March, that bailout was premised on the idea that gas prices would be coming down by 2023, and I think it now appears pretty naive that will happen. The Treasury is now on the hook for increased gas usage this winter, so I think we're likely to see quite a big public comms campaign to try and reduce energy usage. That's not easy to do. The German government and other governments across Europe have been running coordinated campaigns since the beginning of this year to reduce energy usage in the private sector, getting supermarkets to put doors on their freezers, asking shops to turn off their lighting when they're closed, all those kind of things. The UK, again, is going to be coming to this very last minute. I think it characterises a kind of an approach to this crisis which just shows that if we continue down this route, we're going to continue to have insufficient policy responses, and critically, the people, those households who are most suffering with energy prices will suffer. So I'll wrap up just by reiterating that core point that I think is really important, and I want people to take away from this, that Those three priorities are critical to confronting the cost of living crisis, and they're inseparable. We have to do all three at the same time. We have to support businesses to keep the economy ticking over. We have to support households because it's the right and the moral thing to do with their energy prices. But also critically, this is the opportunity to double down on our climate pledge. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So to pick up on George's last theme, I thought we could think a bit more about the medium term, what this looks like for the next 6 months, but also towards that kind of 2-year, 5-year horizon. And one theme that I've heard from your contributions so far is kind of the ad hoc nature or the kind of the last minute approach of support. If you look at ad hoc household support, if you look at the 6-month scheme to support businesses, there's obviously a lack of, a really clear lack of certainty for businesses or families trying to navigate this crisis. What do you think medium-term support needs to look like, and what are the kind of big long-term challenges we need to be grappling with now? Ruini, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple of things that we could and should be thinking about. So just on that point around energy efficiency, we know ultimately that is the longer-term solution here, but what could we be setting up now? So from our perspective, we think that a national energy efficiency programme would be key, so enabling people to make their homes more energy efficient. We know, though, that for some people that's simply out of reach. Sorry, I'll move my hand. So if you look at the most energy efficient homes, the really cold, drafty homes, leaky windows, you're literally throwing your money out of the window because it costs so much to kind of maintain heating and power in your homes. Actually, if you increase their energy efficiency rating to an EPCC, the average cost of that is £3,800. Now, if they do that, they'd save about £950 in their energy bills every year. But if the upfront cost is £3,800, that is simply out of reach for some people. So we think there needs to be a programme of grants, and you scale that in a similar point that others have been making here. To, you offer more to those who can least afford it, but you're enabling them to make savings further down the line. I think there's something else that you could be thinking of in the mobile and broadband space, and I was talking to somebody earlier about this, hello, but we know that many providers are kind of forcing mid-contract price rises on consumers at around £100. And actually, if you look at the total cost of that, I think it's something like 15 million consumers, and you could be increasing costs by 2.5 billion. I need to check my figures, but I think I'm pretty sure on that one. But again, at this point in time, £100 in of itself might not seem that much, but if you balance that across rising food prices, cost of your energy bills, all of that adds up to a very impossible situation for many people. That's why we're asking that broadband and mobile providers should stop those mid-contract prices from next year, but also longer term, we'd like that practice to be stopped altogether. Now, Ofcom don't have the powers to do that, so we'd like them and government to look at solutions there. So there are things that we could be doing in the short to medium term. And sorry, one final point as well. At Citizens Advice, we are seeing more and more people with disabilities coming to us for support. And we know that many of them are facing lengthy delays in personal independence payments. One of the reasons for that is that there are delays in the medical assessment process. That's an existing structure. We could be looking at efficiency there. We could be making it easier for people to access payments that they are entitled to. And again, we've been having conversations with the DWP on this. But really, again, that is something that is a non-fiscal intervention that they should be looking at right now.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about the 5-week wait for universal credit, but very little about the 5-month typical wait for personal independence payments. Simon, I'll come to you next.
Very much agree with everything Ronnie said there. Just to add a couple of points, we should be having a national campaign right now with some of the behavioural change that you could actually reduce bills by 10-15% this winter just through simple things like getting the flow rate right on your combi boiler, for example. There are things that energy suppliers should be doing. We should be having that national campaign right now. Longer term, we do need sticks and carrots. We're going to need some incentives. We're going to need, stamp duty breaks if you improve, your energy efficiency on your property, or council tax breaks. You're going to need backstop regulation. We've seen the transformative effect that banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars has had on the automotive sector. Basically, you'll never see an advert for anything other than an electric vehicle ever again. But what we don't have is that clarity of signal in the housing sector.
Yeah.
We have a fudge of words that says, well, we might do something in the mid-2030s subject to affordability, maybe not. So we need that clarity of signal, And we also need to stop building new houses that we're going to have to retrofit before 2050. So the Future Home Standard, which is currently due to come in 2025, that should be coming in sooner. And we should stop building houses today that'll still be with us in 2050 that we're going to have to retrofit before 2050. That's completely wrong-headed. So we're going to need a mixture of sticks and carrots to make sure that we get this national program right. And one final point, if I may, is we need to rethink the whole institutional architecture for energy policy in this country. So I've long advocated the need for a delivery agency for energy, a national energy agency, if you like. I mean, I think maybe it's similar to your energy efficiency agency. I'd put energy efficiency in there. And that's no disrespect to any of my former colleagues. It's just that the bandwidth in government to think long term is so small at the moment. We need a separate, dedicated delivery agency that could help all those 650 local authorities with advice on how to do this for their particular area. So those would be my additional asks.
Excellent. George?
Yeah, I would very much reiterate both of those points. I think a serious long-term strategy for both demand and supply of energy is absolutely critical. It's the only way we're going to get out of this. I think that on the demand side, we have failed to put in place the right incentives for a long time on energy efficiency and retrofit. It's very clear that homeowners and businesses, or few homeowners and businesses, are going to be making these decisions themselves voluntarily. I think there has to be, because it's very costly, and I think that state support is absolutely required, be that a form of loans for households to support them with energy efficiency measures, or targeted support for specific sectors. And then on the supply side, the energy supply side, we've missed quite significant opportunities at greening our economy, continuing to build houses with gas boilers, which will be illegal in them, is just extremely short-sighted. We need to stop that kind of thing now. And obviously bringing onshore those, on board renewable sources of energy. But it's funny that Simon else mentions that institutional question, because I think that is absolutely right, that ultimately the kind of short-termism of Whitehall, and particularly the Treasury and spending decisions, has been a barrier to both of those things on the demand and the supply side. I think that if you ask people why there hasn't been a serious building retrofit scheme in the UK, the answer is, well, there's lots of problems with skills on getting the right people in the labour market to be able to install this energy efficiency measures. There's problems importing them, it can be costly. But the real problem is that today is the easiest day to make that decision, because it will only get harder and harder and harder from tomorrow. We know that we're going to need to do this quickly, and the quicker you have to do it, the harder those problems are going to become. And also, if there's a problem on the skills side and on the import side, start putting in place the policies to remedy those, and instead of just hoping that the problem will resolve itself over time, because the evidence would say that it's not going to, and we need to start building into those longer-term institutional structures within Whitehall to set that direction.
Could I just add one extra point on this, which is the role of the private sector? I think that having worked with some of the big high street banks, there are financing solutions that can overcome some of that upfront cost. And last year at COP26, I worked on bringing together what we called the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, which was NatWest and Shelter, Worcester Bosch and British Gas. And actually, I think we need those kind of partnerships now, reaching out, as it were, across sectors to bring the private sector's skills and indeed lending and financing solutions to overcome these upfront costs. Because I think we're going to need to pull together in that way if we're to overcome this problem. I was in government it is a graveyard area, energy efficiency. I mean, we had the Green Deal, we had the Zero Carbon Home Standard, we had the Green Homes Grant. These schemes have come and gone. Nothing has actually stuck. Yeah. So we do need, I think, to build this consensus about the right way to do this. It'll have to be public and private working together.
Yeah. And if I can ask a final question as chair before we open up to the audience, that's a signal for anyone who's got a burning question at the tip of your tongue. What role, if you think about our kind of current deepening crisis, nobody's shouted out yet that we've reached parity with the dollar, but I don't know if we're very far away. What roles are for the government in this moment to push a pro-growth agenda? We've heard a lot, both at this conference, we expect we will in the coming days, but also from our new government led by Liz Truss about a pro-growth agenda. What do we need to do to pivot from this crisis into a kind of stronger growth trajectory?
Do you want me to go first? Yeah, I think we now see quite clear dividing lines on that question of economic growth between the government and the opposition. I think what the noises that we have heard from Keir Starmer and probably will hear today from Rachel Reeves, or maybe already have heard from Rachel Reeves, are around exactly what Simon was just setting out of kind of public and private sector working together in a partnership approach. We're sceptical that simply cutting taxes and deregulating the economy is going to be a path to sustainable growth. I think we're expecting to see a bit of kind of like a sugar rush of growth, coming from this mini budget, a massive stimulus into the economy, but very little kind of structural reform of the economy to deliver the long-term growth that we need. And I think where it will come from is getting an industrial strategy right that supports structural changes in the UK economy, supports sectors that we know we need to grow. And it's about government working with the private sector to do that. It's not about rolling up the state and getting out of the way. It's about, I think Tony Danker at the CBI has got this line around grabbing green growth opportunities isn't just about government getting out of the way. They need government to fund the opportunities, to de-risk the opportunities, and to permit the opportunity or something. And I think it's about this balance. There's great examples of where this has worked, and I think the best one is of the success of the AstraZeneca vaccine. There's a great report from the government's Industrial Strategy Council before it was rolled up. And it really cites it as a particularly good example of government knowing what it's good at and the private sector knowing what it's good at and working together in a coordinated way. Government knew it couldn't scale up the kind of vaccine development process, so it worked in collaboration with AstraZeneca. But what it could do is use the heft of government to try and address some of those supply chain constraints, and it could use its procurement to do a kind of purchasing guarantee or a price guarantee to say, if you successfully innovate this product, then we will buy it at 60 million units. Why can't we use the same approach on retrofit? Why can't we use the same approach on renewables? Getting that balance right between the government and the private sector will be critical. And I think from the things that we're hearing, I think the Labour Party understands that. And when they're talking about growth, they're talking about a serious structural industrial strategy which can achieve that.
Thank you. Rooney, Simon, do you want to come in on that question before we open up?
Could I offer another example? I think George's example is a good one. Another example would be the offshore wind industry, where, in a sense, I was still in DEC at the time, we provided a 10-year view for the industry, and the private sector then came and innovated, and now offshore wind farms are being built effectively subsidy-free. Yeah. Indeed, even better than that, the latest offshore wind farms are actually paying consumers back under the scheme that we put in place back then, the so-called Contract for Difference scheme. If you provide the private sector with that clarity of the long-term signal, including some upfront funding to get the industry moving, you can create the industries of the future. We need the same approach on hydrogen. We need the same approach on carbon capture and storage now. We need to actually follow through. I totally agree with George. Now is not the time to have a wobble and a sort of, pull back. We've now got to double down on these industries if we're to create the green jobs around the country that are possible for the new economy we need to build. So it's about sustainable growth, not, as I think George used the phrase, sugar rush growth of, the next couple of years. That's what we need to be doing, and I think we can do it. We know we can do it. We just need to follow the same consistent path, and the private sector will respond if the signals are there for the long term.
Full steam ahead.
The only thing I'd add is, I think Georgie made this point earlier, we all have a role to play in stimulating growth, whether that's nationally, regionally, locally, on your high street. So how are we enabling that to happen? We shouldn't be leaving people behind. Yeah. So how are we enabling them to make a positive contribution and giving them also, as a consumer, the skills and knowledge to make those informed choices as well? I think that's the only point I'd add.
Absolutely. And something we think and talk a lot about as IPPR is not just growth for growth's sake, but obviously the pattern and the distribution of growth across the country as well, who's sharing in it. I'll now open up to the audience for questions. So if you want to put your hand up. We've got a couple at the front here, so I'll go first to the two at the front.
Thanks very much. Really, really interesting. Beth Colity from Versus Arthritis. Rowana, you gave an example of someone with osteoarthritis not being able to heat their home. And we know that prior to the crisis, people with arthritis were facing costs of about £1,700 a year, additionally, to manage their condition, basically. So just to pick up on that point around what targeted support to people with health conditions, disabilities should look like, particularly where some of that, behavioural messaging around less energy usage is going to exacerbate their health condition even more.
We'll take a couple together and then come back.
Thank you so much. Grace Williams, leader of Waltham Forest Council. I really agree with the analysis and the focus that we've had on energy and the longer-term change that we need. From a sort of local authority perspective or a public services perspective, it would be interesting to hear your comments on how we also need to address the public services crisis that we're seeing in terms of funding. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't start this crisis where we are now. We've had 10 years of austerity, fall in pay, organisations like schools, local authorities, health partners, in a really poor state. And Rowana, you talked about the need to target help to people, and some of that equation will be through public services. It would be interesting to hear your comments about how we can do that.
Great. Who would like to come in there? We had questions both on what targeted support needs to look like and what we should do about the public services funding crisis. Who's brave enough to start us off? Rooney?
I could do the targeted. I'll start off with the targeted support one. Yeah, you're right. We saw that earlier this year, didn't we, with Rishi Sunak in terms of the support that was provided. So that was a combination of looking at council tax bans and seeing who could be eligible for that, but then also looking at targeted support through the benefit system. Again, it's the most effective and efficient way to do that. The infrastructure is there. We'd leave this, well, there are other ways that you could be considering this. I think an interesting question is, could you be combining the ability of energy companies to provide reduced bills, given their knowledge of their customer service base, and combining that with the knowledge that government have on who needs that targeted support? Maybe it's a similar point to that kind of partnership approach. But I think we should be looking at the existing infrastructures that are in place. But also, again, as you say, there are people with long-term health conditions where they have higher energy costs due to their condition, due to maybe the equipment they need to have. So how are we enabling them? And how can we support them? So is there, again, looking at things like energy efficiency, could we be giving them grants to enable them to make their homes more efficient? I really couldn't agree more on that public education campaign, helping people to understand the choices that they have. So combining the knowledge with the ability to make those choices is something that I'd argue is really important.
I'd agree with that, and I think on that kind of targeted support question, it's going to be really important that we have further targeted support over the winter as well. There was some figures earlier in the year, I think from the Food Foundation, that 2 million adults went without food for a whole day because they couldn't afford it or were struggling with their energy prices. And that was in May, and if you think back to where energy prices were in May, even with the energy price cap that the government are putting in place, prices will still be significantly higher than that. There will still be a lot of people struggling with their energy bills this winter, despite the enormous costs and the enormous expense of the price cap that has been put in place and that has rightly been put in place. And we also continue to see wider inflation in other bits of the economy as well. Food and other essentials are continuing to contribute to CPI inflation. And the continuing fall of the pound will further worsen that situation. So there's really quite like a sustained problem over the winter. So I think it's not just about, dusting our hands off and saying, oh, well, the price cap's done, that's solved all the problems. I think there'll obviously need to be more support. But we did quite a lot of thinking earlier in the year after the spring statement, when the Chancellor had failed to put in place some of the support that we thought was needed, trying to find routes in the universal credit and welfare system to get money targeted to the people who need it was actually very hard, and we ended up with quite a lot of sympathy with the Chancellor that you end up doing something universal, because there are just insufficient tools within that system to either get far enough up the income stream with the challenge of this depth, or to those people with those kind of specific conditions of the kind of thing that you're talking about. And we have to step back, and if we're talking about how to take a more long-term approach, the kind of work that Rachel and the Work and Welfare State team at IPPR do, really question, how have we managed to spend the past decade doing a systemic review of the welfare system in the UK that's still totally not fit for purpose to get money to the kind of people that you and that Ruwani were describing earlier? It's a real problem. And I think on the local authorities point, I think you mentioned pay there, and I think pay is really important. Over the past 10 years, again, we've seen widening disparity between pay in the public and private sectors. And I think that there's a risk that we've kind of cut so far back that there's no fat left to cut in some of those sectors. My brother is a fireman, and one of the things that I've learned speaking to him is that people in serious need kind of end up hitting the welfare system and the public services in very strange places. So like firemen end up being like the front line in social services because various bits of the state have been rolled so far back. I think we're in a really terrible situation, and I think this winter could be a really serious crisis. So yeah, I think looking at that kind of local authorities and how public services can support people is critical, but we need to make sure that we're building a sustainable service and paying people as well.
I'll go out for some more questions, so please put your hands up. We've got one at the front here, and then somebody in the red further back.
I can't see anyone on this side.
Yeah,
of the room.
there's lovely kind of glare coming off the water all behind you.
Hi, my name is Ishmael, and I work for MENCAP. People on lower incomes and benefits are already having to choose between food and heat. Over 60% of people who were referred to food banks in early 2022 were disabled. Many people with a learning disability need more support from the government. What does the panel think about this? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Philip Schofield from UK Youth. Clearly, I'm probably one of the younger ones in the room. I'm only 17, and currently moving out of my parents' house seems almost inconceivable for me right now. And I don't even want to think about what it is for you guys in England, because we don't have to pay for our university. But under 18 pay is £4.81, and for 18 to 20-year-olds, it's only £2 more than that. So even trying to think of studying and working, and some people do try to have full-time jobs while studying, but it's highly advised against because you're trying to work for your degree. So I'm just wondering how the panel feels that there should be more support for students as well, because some of these people are full-time workers, and sometimes students get left out of the equation, even though we are the ones who are moving forward with our generation.
Thanks very much. Excellent questions. Who would like to come in first on either of those? Politeness from the panel. Rooney, you're up.
Yeah, some really, really good questions and important questions. And just on the first point around the support for people with disabilities and their experiences, absolutely, we'd agree with that. We see that through our own services. We're seeing a rising number of people with disabilities coming to Citizens Advice for support. And I'm sure I've got the breakdown of our referral path to crisis support, but again, crisis support would be referrals to food banks, it'd be fuel vouchers. We run a service in partnership with Mind and the Trussell Trust called Help Through Hardship. And again, we're just seeing astronomical support there. It gives us a real indication of the different communities that are being disproportionately affected. And I think that's a really important point to consider. Not just looking at that big overarching number, which in itself is concerning and slightly scary in itself, but within that, which are the communities that are being particularly affected and what would help them the most. So I completely agree with that point.
Yeah, and on the youth question, I have a huge amount of sympathy. I think the Centre for Economic Justice, one of the things that we think is absolutely critical is that we need to hardwire the UK economy for fairness and justice, and that's across a whole range of different aspects of economic justice, and one of them is absolutely intergenerational fairness, and that we are, or you rather, are entering an economy that for the first time younger people will be earning less and have worse career prospects than their parents. It's a sign that I think we have failed to build an economy that works, and people very visibly are feeling that, whether it's across housing costs, cost of education, like you described, the cost of childcare, which is something Rachel and the team have worked a lot on at IPPR. But the solutions aren't easy either. I think it's about taking that whole economy approach. I don't have a huge amount of hope that this current government are going to be doing that, and I think, but the problem is very real, so I have a huge amount of sympathy with you.
Just to add to that, I'm proud that KPMG is a living wage employer, so we pay the living wage, and I think what worries me, just to tie some of the threads together, unless we find a way to target the support, we won't have the money for public services that we need.
Yeah.
To improve housing, to improve transport, to improve education, to improve the health service. So I think it's incumbent upon us. I appreciate it's difficult to find those, how do we target best, but I think we do need to find that way to target support. Otherwise, all we're doing is racking up the bill, unfortunately, for future generations, and that really, really worries me.
It's a good point, right? The stories that we tell about the economy and how the economy works and how we're going to grow the economy matter, because if we tell ourselves things that aren't true, we end up cutting our tax revenue, which means that we end up handicapping ourselves further down the line and failing to put in place the kind of social structures that we need. But it also means that fundamentally people will suffer. And I think that's why we need to be thinking about these kind of things, the way that we talk about growth, the way that we talk about the economy, because that is so, that's right. We risk, like you see with the current government, with these tax cuts, which are not going to help growth. They're going to reduce government revenue and they're going to further endanger public services. It's a circular problem.
I'll come out for some more questions in just a minute, but I'll abuse my privilege as chair in the first instance, just to speak to your question again. And some of the things we've been hearing through other research projects that are live at the moment at IPPR is some really concerning kind of trends from, particularly from kind of frontline support workers working with families who are directly affected by this crisis, is kind of groups of people moving out of whether it's homeless accommodation, temporary accommodation, or kind of care leavers looking to be independently housed for the first time. People are resisting what would previously have been very positive life events because of the rising cost of having an independent home, and that being something that people are hearing day by day. The idea of you finally being able to have a stable house, not being the positive experience that it should be because bills are at such a level that feels completely unaffordable and unmanageable. And that's the kind of depth of the crisis that we're in now, and obviously we're expecting it not to improve drastically over this winter, so that need for targeted support is obviously kind of top of our list. I'll go out for some more questions now. Please do put hands up, or we stunned everyone into silence. Nope, we've got somebody at the back and then somebody at the front here, I think. Yeah, back over here, this side.
Hi, I'm Tom Flood from the Charities Aid Foundation. We heard from Ronnie about the experience of one excellent large charity, but I was just wondering about the panel's thoughts on what we're seeing the role of charities being in this crisis, given that we know, and it was alluded to earlier, that they're facing, coming out of the pandemic, which was massively challenging, they're now facing their own problems with falling donations year on year as people's disposable incomes are squeezed. They're facing rising demand, as we were hearing about, and they're also facing their own rising costs. Now, thankfully, they were included in the government's kind of definition of business in its support, but clearly over the last however many years, more than a decade, more of what the state was doing when we're talking about safety nets is now being done by charities. So I guess it's a question about what specifically could the government be doing to support charities, and where does that go as we go through the crisis and beyond?
Thank you. And we had a question at the front here. Okay. I think we have Seema Malhotra about to join us for our last 15 minutes, which is good news.
Hi there,
ahead,
Matt
please.
from MenCap as well. So the government is set to uprate benefits in April 2023. Do the panel think that this should be brought forward, or there should be a bigger uprate now that the costs, because it's meant to be in line with inflation, do they think, one, do you think it should be brought forward, and do you think it should be at inflation levels now or inflation levels in, if it's left till April?
Yeah. Who would like to come in there quickly, and then we'll get Seema once she's sorted.
I'm happy to. So yeah, role of the charity sector. We have a really important role to play. We are at the front line of supporting people facing really challenging situations, and it takes all of us as a sector to work together and think about how we can best deliver that, whatever the size of the organisation. So I think there's an important role to look at the environment within which we operate, the support that is provided by government. As you say, it's a really challenging income market in terms of fundraising, but looking at how we can support each other. So again, delivering services in unison and in partnership is something that we do in Citizens Advice. We also look at how we can collaborate in different ways. So if I can quickly plug something that we do every month, we share the data that we're seeing through our services in monthly online events. We look at how that we can break that down. We would always be happy to consider how we can share that data to enable other organisations to be really a powerful advocate for the communities that they serve as well. So I think that's an important role to play. And briefly on benefit uprating, absolutely, they need to be uprated far quicker. Because by the time it kicks in, it doesn't even reflect the rate of inflation. So absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, and I'd echo from an IPPR perspective, we think it needs to be, that uprating needs to happen as soon as possible, and it also probably needs to include October inflation to reflect that further energy price cap rise. So thank you very much to Seema Malhotra for joining us, hot off the back of what I hear is lots of economic policy announcements from the main hall. So Seema is Shadow Minister for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Thank you very much for joining us today. And once you've got yourself settled within for the very fast arrival, we'll hear a few opening comments for you. We've been discussing kind of every angle into cost of living crisis with a kind of focus on energy and business, but also on what household support is needed now and in the longer term. Great. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, do you want me to start? Right, okay, well look, thank you very much. Look, it's wonderful to be able to join you, and I'm really sorry that I've got caught in the conference hall with all that's gone on. Look, I'm just going to share a few reflections about how people can be properly supported, because there is clearly a recognition that the cost of living crisis and what people are going through is totally unsustainable. And I think we'll be really worried now about what's happening in the markets and the consequences of that for both households, likely to see, for those who are homeowners, higher mortgage rates, and for those who are businesses as well, where they might have been borrowing to invest in improvements, the cost that's going to come on top of the cost that people are currently experiencing. And there's a real concern that this is unpredictable. It's utterly unpredictable where the costs are going to go. And when you can plan for how things are going to increase in price, as a business or as a household, government can plan alongside you. We're in utterly uncharted territory, and I think there's a really important kind of acknowledgement in conference that the Tories have confidence in the markets, but the markets don't seem to have confidence in the Tories anymore. And the downside of that in terms of the weakening of our institutions, whether that is how the civil service previously has been weakened. Now I think our governance is under challenge and less trusted. The Bank of England is being attacked and is likely to then be blamed for what's happening. It's very interesting how Kwasi Kwarteng reacted to some of this. But we also know that while costs are going up and inflation is rising, government support and real income isn't keeping up as well. One of the important announcements that Rachel has just made in conference is that we have got to recognise this and what it means for households. And it's the reason why we have said that if we were in government, she would be writing to the Low Pay Commission to say that the living wage should genuinely reflect the cost of living. And I think to have our institutions tying together at a strategic level for thinking about national policy and then the message for the country, about how we are going to need to see a way in which people are supported, not to fall into debt and then potentially lose their homes, and so on, but to actually be sustained, to be supportive. Because a key message that I think has come out and tying so much together in our broader economic policy is that unless families and businesses are doing well, the country is not going to be doing well. For too long, I think we've seen a silo of policy. You know, this government has been increasingly less joined up in terms of how Treasury has been connected and working with other departments as well. We've had a weakening of industrial strategy as well, so no direction to business, large or small, for where to invest for the future. When it's come to the green economy, which is where, you know, it's what businesses have said to me as well, is we want to do the right thing. We want to be part of the future. We want to know how to transition. We want to know how to measure our carbon footprint. We want to know what to do first, second, and third. We want to know how to reskill our workforce. We want to know what we should be reskilling them to do. I've had further education colleges saying, I want to put on courses. We want to know what to train people to do. We want to know where the jobs are going to be. And yet there's no answer from the government. So even during the last 2 or 3 years, through the COVID period, I have watched as we have lost time and we have ceased to be on the front foot when it's come to the challenges that we're facing. So I think there is something very important to do, which is about tackling the immediate crises, where we have been on the front foot and calling for the energy price cap freeze. And also we've said how we would pay for that clearly through the windfall tax on oil and gas producers. But we've got the energy security crisis as well, which is why we're saying now, and this is about giving confidence to others to invest as well, we're saying that we want to see a future that is a green future with clean energy by 2030. And Keir also talked about, look, you know, you may have to have some transition over that, but you've got to have a goal and you've got to have a target so that you're working towards that and giving some direction to where the country's going, to give confidence to invest. And that is incredibly important because we've got to break out of this vicious cycle. Unless we have a way in which we're bringing confidence to invest, we're not going to be bringing business confidence, and we're not going to be bringing consumer confidence, which is also now hitting a low. And the problem with that is that as people start to feel that any spare cash they may have or savings they may have, they've got to keep because of the uncertainty of the winter and what comes next, your businesses in your communities are going to see a reduction of consumer spending. And you're going to see this vicious cycle of going down with our high streets decline, businesses closing. We have had quarter after quarter, 4 or 5 quarters now, of over 100,000 business deaths. And that has been unprecedented. The first time we saw the statistics, we were like, crikey, maybe that's just COVID and the impact. Then it was the second quarter, then it was the third, and then it's the fourth. And without something that's a sustainable message for the economy as a whole and bringing back confidence, we're not going to break out of this, and we're not going to have both the shorter term measures to support, but also the longer term measures that will give confidence.
Thank you very much, Seema, and thank you for joining us. I'll take maybe a final couple of questions if we have them from the audience before we close. Does anyone have a burning question? Or are we, oh, yeah. Somebody always crumbles under pressure. I think we had one here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Hemant from Chartered Institute of Taxation.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you see how Seema Malhotra and the panel think that the tax system can help us to deal with the problems of the cost of living. The secondary question, if you have time, are we in the transition zone to green energy? Because the Russians know that they can squeeze us, and we've got to at least get into the transition zone, surely, now, rather than sort of talk about it. That's just my opinion.
That's great, thank you. And we had another at the front here, I think.
My name is Ishmael from NCAP, and just want to ask a question on disabled people pay on average of £583 a month more than non-disabled people to live the same quality of life. And the rising costs of food and energy are on top of the extra costs that comes with having a learning disability in the first place. What does the panel think about this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn first to you, Seema.
Yeah, I'll just, I think, probably make a couple of remarks on your question. Look, thank you for that question, because one of the things that we have said even before the current crisis, because frankly we've had crisis after crisis, not just COVID, we've had the lorries crisis and the HGV drivers, we've had the supply chain crises, we've had the fuel crisis, we've had the CO2 crisis, which is back, but not getting as many headlines at the moment. Look, all of that is pushing up costs. And those costs are, in the end, if businesses stay open, are going to have to be passed on to their customers, quite likely. But one of the things that we do think in terms of reforming taxation, and particularly around business taxation, is, for example, changes to business rates. Because business rates are effectively a cost up front, whether or not you've made a penny in profit. And there's also an unequal world in which a system that has been based on bricks and mortar businesses around the corner from us or in our communities is not in line with how businesses are growing online that don't pay a fair share of tax, arguably. So there is some shift, and I think it's one of the reasons why that has been so welcomed by the FSB and others is because it is recognising that you've got to work with businesses and have a more flexible and fairer taxation system that is working with rewarding as well as looking sustainably. And then I think the second on transition, I think we're in a slow transition, but we need to be in the fast lane. And look, we've had some successes in offshore wind, but I've been talking to ports and others this morning. I've been doing the business forum since 7:45. And what the interesting thing is the feeling that there isn't any clarity of direction. Like, where do you go to make life easier when you're waiting to be part of this transition for the generation of hydrogen or on offshore wind? And for us as well, look, we are prioritising onshore wind and solar as well. And you've got to have a way in which you're working with the country and helping with enabling those efforts to happen much more quickly, those investments to happen. At the moment, we seem to be in the slow lane on direction and decision making. So certainly, I think our view is we need to get in the fast lane. We've now set a target for clean energy by 2030. And what I think it will positively do is tie in with local government strategies, where Hounslow Council, as one example, has developed a green strategy for recovery. Now, if you were to make those strategies on paper a reality, you've got to have the decision-making, the powers, the guidance, the investment, and the finance locally and nationally, and from private finance initiatives as well, to be going into these so that communities can also have that green power and be supported in that. So I think that was, that's a really significant part of how we would work to deliver that collectively. But I'll make one final point. One of the things that Rachel also said was about the National Wealth Fund today. And it's certainly an idea that we've been thinking about for some time. But the way it's come together, and so importantly, is to say where you've got some of these calls that you need to make as a nation to scale and quickly, you can have a way in which the return comes to taxpayers and to the country. And people who are working as well can feel rewarded because they know some of that, some of the profits, the share, is going to come back to the country, be able to go into public services and go to people.
Thank you very much. Simon, did you want to come in?
Very much agree with those comments. I mean, the thing I'd add is that I've got clients lining up to invest in green infrastructure from around the world. There is no shortage of private sector capital ready to go if the frameworks are right. And Seema, you mentioned offshore wind. We've had a great success. As I mentioned earlier, we need to repeat that with hydrogen, with carbon capture, with the other low carbon sectors. The money is there. It's about now providing the regulatory clarity for private sector investors to invest in those sectors. And to your question about the tax system, we should absolutely be using the tax system to incentivise this. That includes carbon pricing. I mentioned earlier some examples on energy efficiency, which You could have stamp duty rebates, you could have council tax breaks. We have to start using the tax system to create the sustainable economy that we need to see. Green taxes seem to have a bad name these days, a bad rep. They actually still work. We just need to start using them.
Thank you. Rooney, George, do you want to come in on those questions? And then to give you all a bit of a warning, I'll give you a kind of a moment to make final comments as we close as a panel as well.
I think I would just agree with the points that have been made, to be honest. I don't think I have too much to add on that one.
George? Yeah, super. Seema, I'll give you just a minute or two to make any final comments you wanted to make to the room, and then we'll close up.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Look, I'll just make this a couple of final comments, which is that, we start off talking about how people can be properly supported through the cost of living crisis. My worry is that we think about this just in terms of the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, or at least the government does. And it seems to then create the sort of cliff edge at which the next bit of uncertainty comes. I think the reality is that the cost of living crisis and what it's meaning for families that have been first affected, it's a bit of a first in, last out. Those that are first affected and really struggling, and we see them in our constituencies, the kind of casework coming through, the pressure on the CAB, they're going to be struggling for a lot longer than, say, for example, Kwasi Kwarteng and his friends who might be getting the benefits of some of his decisions last week, with those on £1 million being 50 plus thousand pounds better off. So I don't think trickle down is going to work. And I think it's going to take some time for bottom up and middle out to deliver in the context that we find ourselves in now. Because what we're going to see as a result of the decisions made last Friday is a weakening of our economic infrastructure and a weakening of confidence that's going to push those that are already in difficult financial situations even more to the fringe. So we've got to be thinking long term about how families have got to have financial security rebuilt, which is not going to be just a period of getting through your bills for the next 3 to 6 months. It's got to be much more than that. Because if you think about it, we've seen child poverty rise and not fall. My worry is, when I was thinking about last Friday, what 1 penny was there for children? What 1 penny? And you're going to see poverty and families under strain. And unless we keep our eye on their journey, they're going to be under the radar with a really deep structural problem then that we'll have for the economy for much longer.
Thank you very much. George?
Yeah, really to kind of continue from some of those points that Seema made, I think just to go back to those 3 things that were really critical right at the top of my opening remarks, and we've heard great examples from the floor today, for example, from charities like MenCap and from Arthritis UK, of the need to support households through this crisis, both with incomes but also specific support for their circumstances, because we know that this crisis will affect different people in different ways. Just on the question earlier was on tax reform. Tax cuts aren't going to help people in that way. We know that if you cut a progressive tax, that is regressive. The primary benefit goes to those who are most well off rather than those who need it the most. And we need to look seriously at welfare reform to ensure that we're not in a situation again where our safety net appears to be totally inadequate or offering the support that we need. We need to look at the economy and how we can support it, how we can increase productivity and investment. Again, very much agree with Simon. We need quite targeted incentives to support the firms that are doing the things that we know we need to do, investing in the green economy, investing in the productive economy. Again, cuts to headline rates of corporation tax are not going to achieve that. That blanket support is not going to lead to that kind of revolution that we know we need. But the kind of things that Rachel has been talking about today with the National Wealth Fund, that kind of directional support, directional strategy working to decisively shift the direction of travel of the UK economy is absolutely essential. And then just to reiterate that final point around climate, that this energy crisis is a crisis of fossil fuel. It's a crisis of our failure to install enough energy efficiency and our failure to install enough renewable energy in the past. But now is the time to double down on our ambition if we're going to be serious about confronting this crisis.
Thank you. Simon?
I just want to repeat one of the stats I mentioned earlier. We're going to be spending £1 billion over 3 years on energy efficiency. We're spending 1 billion every 3 days on the build support package. We're going to have to find a way to target that in order to focus it on those that need it most. That's both the households and the businesses that need it most, and provide some permanent long-term solutions. We can't just carry on with blanket support for everybody forever, because clearly it's going to end up with higher inflation and higher interest rates, which we'll all be paying for.
Thank you. Rooney?
Yeah, it's been really great to be part of this discussion and also hear the real consensus that we have around some of the solutions that we could be reaching here. Sadly, we're all too familiar with the needs of people right now and how the hardest are being hit. We know that we need to have short and long-term solutions. We know that we need some clarity and detail on some of the short-term solutions, but there are also things that we can and should be doing. So I think the few final points I'd make are, we are concerned at Citizens Advice about people who are struggling with energy bills being forced onto prepayment meters. We'd like that practice to certainly stop from now. We'd like Ofgem to begin the ability to stop that practice altogether. It's disconnection through the back door. As people are going into the winter, they're going to be facing really difficult choices, and just having their energy cut off, we're hugely concerned about that. Again, we've talked about mid-contract price rises. We'd be keen for mobile and broadband providers to stop doing that from next year at least. Again, we'd like Ofcom to have the ability and authority to stop that practice altogether. I could also be talking about debt and people who fall into debt and the choices that they have, and some of the quite aggressive tactics that some people are facing on how to manage their debts and the options open to them. There needs to be a bit more regulation there as well. We've talked about the needs around long-term solutions and energy efficiency being a key on that. I think what I'd reiterate there is just let's be inclusive. Let's make sure that we are not leaving communities behind. Make sure that we are targeting those who need the help, who actually also, if we made their homes more efficient, we'd be reducing our national consumption of energy. Again, it's that point that we all have a role to play in our energy demand, but also in the growth that we want to see as well. So let's make sure that we are targeting support to those who need it the most, but enabling consumers to make those informed choices as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. So that just leaves me to thank our fantastic panel today, to thank our sponsors, KPMG, for putting on this event with us, IPPR, and to thank you for being such a lively and engaged audience. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you very much.